The story begins on a night when the bells of Mount Harrow stopped ringing. It was the spring of 1843, and the town was swaddled in the kind of silence that follows an unspeakable act. The moon had risen thin and white over the plantation fields, where wind moved through the stalks like a whisper of guilt. Inside a red barn behind the main house, the master's son, Jonathan Harlow, was found with 3 of his father's enslaved women. They were not caught in violence nor in servitude, but in something the town would later call the ritual of flesh. His father, Amos Harlow, stood in the doorway, torchlight trembling in his hand, and saw the scene as if God himself had withdrawn his gaze. The next morning, all of Mount Harrow smelled of iron and honey. The servants swore they heard hymns in reverse humming from the rafters of the barn. The women, Althea, Miriam, and Ruth, were said to have spoken a single sentence in unison before being dragged outside. "He is bound to us now." What followed was stranger still. Instead of punishment or sale, Amos gathered the entire town in the square by the old courthouse and declared that his son would marry the 3 women, publicly, under the eyes of the Lord, the law, and the dead. It was not mercy. It was atonement. Or so he claimed. No one in Mount Harrow ever forgot that day. The air was thick with the smell of burning magnolia branches, and the bells that had gone silent began to toll again, though no one was seen pulling the ropes. Some swore the sound came from underground beneath the cobblestones, beneath the roots of the town itself. That was the beginning of the curse, of the silence, of the slow unraveling of the Harlow line. At noon, on the 3rd Sunday after the barn incident, the town of Mount Harrow gathered in the square beneath a sky the color of unpolished steel. The courthouse clock had stopped the night before, frozen at 11:57, but still the townsfolk arrived as if summoned by something older than time. Word had spread. Amos Harlow's son would be joined in marriage to 3 of his father's slaves. No one knew if it was madness, guilt, or divine punishment that drove him. Yet the people came dressed in their Sunday black, clutching hymnals like shields. Even the preacher, Reverend Silas Pree, had been ordered to officiate. Though witnesses swore his hands trembled so violently that his Bible nearly slipped from his grip. The women were brought forward in white dresses that were not theirs, borrowed from the dead, faded wedding gowns from the trunks of forgotten brides. Their veils were made from torn mosquito netting, their feet bare on the dust. Jonathan stood before them, pale and hollow-eyed, as though he had not slept since that night in the barn. His father watched from the steps, eyes dry, mouth hard, refusing to blink. No music played, only the sound of crows gathering on the courthouse roof. When the vows were spoken, something in the air changed. The wind dropped. Dogs howled miles away. The Reverend's voice faltered as the 3 women, in perfect unison, whispered words that were not in the good book, phrases soft and rhythmic, as if spoken through generations of buried tongues. Jonathan repeated them unconsciously, his voice echoing theirs until the square fell utterly silent. Then came the bells, 3 strikes each deeper than the last, vibrating through the ground. Those nearest swore they saw the cobblestones pulse as if the town itself had drawn a breath. By nightfall, birds refused to nest in the square, and by morning, Amos Harlow's fields had withered in a perfect circle around the barn, like something sacred had been scorched into the earth. At dawn, the field behind the Harlow estate looked as though a giant hand had pressed itself into the soil. The cotton had browned overnight, forming a perfect ring 50 paces wide. At its center stood the old barn, silent, untouched, but breathing somehow, as if the timbers themselves carried a pulse. The slaves refused to go near it. Even the overseer, a man who once whipped a pregnant woman for stealing corn, would not cross the ring. They said the air inside felt thicker, harder to breathe. Some claimed they saw heat shimmer over the circle, though the morning was cool. Amos Harlow called it nonsense, until he sent one of the men inside to prove his point. The man's name was Ephraim, and he walked into the circle whistling to mock the others. But before he reached the barn doors, he stopped, dropped to his knees, and began clawing the earth as though trying to dig something up. His mouth moved, but no sound came. When they dragged him back, his eyes were open, pupils wide, staring at the sun. He never spoke again. He simply sat beneath the magnolia tree, tracing circles in the dirt with his fingers until the day he died. Jonathan, now husband to 3 wives he barely spoke to, began to change as well. He stopped eating, stopped shaving. Some nights he would wander barefoot into the fields, standing motionless in the center of the ring until dawn. When asked what he was doing, he said only, "Listening." His wives began to hum at night, soft, discordant melodies that made the house creak. The servants whispered that the circle was not burned, but branded, that something beneath the soil had claimed its mark. By the time the preacher returned to bless the land, the shape had deepened. The grass inside turned black and brittle. When he sprinkled it with holy water, the droplets hissed. And as he turned to flee, he swore he heard a woman's voice whisper from the barn, "We are still waiting." By midsummer, the Harlow house had begun to rot from the inside out. It started in the floorboards, small patches that turned black beneath the rugs, spreading like bruises under the skin of the home. The maids complained that the smell of damp wood clung to their dresses, and that no matter how many candles they burned, the air still tasted of iron and mold. Amos blamed the humidity, but the rot moved too fast, too deliberate. It climbed the walls like ivy, reaching toward the upstairs rooms where Jonathan and his 3 wives slept. Each of the women had been given a separate chamber, though they often appeared together, gliding through the halls before dawn. Their footsteps made no sound. The servants said they whispered through the vents in voices low and overlapping, a chorus of words that seemed neither English nor prayer. Jonathan, once proud and reckless, now moved like a ghost within his own house. He avoided mirrors. He spoke to no one but his wives, and even then only in fragments. "They're calling again. It's in the rafters. Don't let Father dig." Then the portraits began to fade. One by one, the oil paintings that lined the hall lost their color. Faces that had once been bright with pride turned gray and featureless, until the eyes were nothing more than empty sockets. The preacher was called again, but refused to enter, saying, "Whatever lives in that home answers to no church I know." The final sign came with the stench of dead things, a sweet cloying rot that drifted from the parlor vents. When they pried open the grates, they found bird carcasses, dozens of them, wings folded, throats cleanly cut, placed in a circle as if arranged by invisible hands. Amos ordered the vents sealed, but the smell grew stronger. That night, he woke to find muddy footprints on his bedroom floor, leading from the barn to his bed. They stopped at the footboard facing him. In the morning, the circle in the field had grown larger. No one in Mount Harrow would enter the Harlow house after August. The rot had spread into the very breath of the place. Windows fogged from the inside even in heat, and flies gathered in corners where no decay could be found. The servants fled first, muttering that the walls whispered their names as they worked. One maid, a young girl named Dinah, returned to fetch her belongings and ran screaming from the threshold. She claimed she heard voices pressed between the plaster, children crying, women singing in a language that tasted of salt and blood. At night, Jonathan's wives could be seen through the upstairs windows, moving in circles, their white dresses glowing faintly in the dark. Sometimes one would stop and look down toward the field, and the others would follow, turning in perfect synchronization until their faces vanished into shadow. Townsfolk began to gather at the gate, watching in silence, unable to look away. It was said that if you stood there long enough, the glass would fog and a handprint would appear on the inside, always too small to belong to any of the women. Inside, Amos Harlow had taken to sleeping in his study, gun beside his chair. He wrote letters to the church, to distant relatives, even to the governor, begging for someone to sanctify his land. No one replied. His ink bled through the pages as if the paper itself resisted holding his words. Jonathan, meanwhile, spent his nights in the barn, whispering to the soil. Sometimes he would emerge at dawn with blood around his mouth, claiming the earth had spoken back. The townspeople began hearing the walls too, not just in the Harlow home, but in their own. The sound spread like a fever through Mount Harrow, murmurs in chimneys, sobs beneath floorboards, hymns rising through the drains. The preacher called it hysteria, yet his own church doors began to warp and breathe, the wood pulsing like living flesh. And on the seventh night, every clock in town stopped at once, all striking 3, all at the same instant, all whispering the same thing: "We are still bound." By early autumn, the town of Mount Harrow had fallen under a silence that no church bell could break. The Reverend tried to gather his congregation for Sunday service, but only a handful came. Gaunt faces, eyes darting toward the windows as if afraid the sound of prayer itself might draw something closer. The pews groaned when they knelt. The floorboards beneath the altar had begun to swell, soft with moisture, and when the Reverend lifted the rug to inspect them, he found black roots threading through the planks, like veins searching for a heartbeat. The town's children spoke of voices in their wells calling their names at night. Livestock were found mutilated in precise circular patterns, tongues removed, hearts missing, eyes replaced with river stones. The sheriff blamed wolves, though none had been seen in the county for decades. He rode out toward the Harlow property and returned before sunset, pale and shaking. When asked what he'd seen, he said only, "The field's grown another circle." In the absence of faith, superstition took hold. Doors were marked with crosses of salt. Mothers sewed charms into their children's collars, and men whispered the Harlow name like it might summon ruin if spoken too loud. No one dared confront Amos directly, but rumors spread that he'd buried something in the field, something that had not been human when it was alive. One evening, the Reverend stood before his cracked mirror and recited the Lord's Prayer to steady himself. But the reflection did not follow his lips. It smiled instead, its mouth moving faster until the sound of 100 whispers filled the room. He smashed the glass, but the whispering did not stop. It seeped from the shards like escaping breath. By October, Mount Harrow had ceased to pray altogether. The church doors stayed locked. The bells stayed still, and those who lived nearest the Harlow estate began to wake with dirt under their fingernails, though none remembered leaving their beds. The fields, they said, were calling everyone now. It was in the 3rd week of October when the preacher's wife found the ledger, a small leather-bound book wrapped in twine, hidden beneath the pulpit. Its pages were stained with wax and rust-colored blotches that looked too dark to be ink. Inside were entries written in Amos Harlow's hand, dated agreements, signatures, and one phrase repeated at the bottom of every page: "By bond of soil, by vow of flesh." The final entry bore the date of Jonathan's wedding and a line scrawled beneath it: "All debts must be joined in blood." That night, the preacher confronted Amos in his study. Witnesses recalled hearing shouts, a crash, then silence. When the Reverend stumbled from the house hours later, his hair had turned white. He carried the ledger pressed against his chest and muttered, "It wasn't a marriage, and it was an exchange." He left town before dawn, never to return. The ledger disappeared with him. Those who pieced together fragments of the story believed Amos had entered into a pact, not with God, but with something older, buried deep beneath the plantation's soil. The slaves whispered of an old root, a spirit of the land that fed on lineage, binding families to the earth they owned until both rotted together. By marrying Jonathan to the 3 women, Amos had sealed the Harlow name into that covenant. The union wasn't holy, it was contractual, a merging of bloodlines to ensure the family's dominion would never end, or never escape. After the preacher's flight, Jonathan's wives began to show signs of pregnancy. All 3 at once. Their eyes grew darker, their voices deeper, and their skin took on the sheen of soil after rain. At night, the house echoed with lullabies sung in 3 harmonies that no one recognized. Amos forbade anyone from entering their rooms. He locked the doors himself and kept the keys in his pocket. 2 weeks later, the keys were found outside the barn door, still warm, as if freshly held. From inside came a low humming sound, like a cradle rocking in the dark. The first frost came early that year, sharp enough to split bark and silence the crickets. It was the night the three wives went into labor. Not in the house, but beneath the barn, where the soil had hollowed into a cavern over the growing circle. The servants who remained claimed they were summoned there by Jonathan himself, his voice breaking through the cold like an echo from the ground. When they arrived, they found him shirtless, trembling, kneeling in the dirt as the women labored in perfect unison, their moans folding into one sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. There were no midwives, no prayers. Only Jonathan whispering fragments of scripture twisted out of meaning. And the seed shall return to its root, and the root shall become flesh again. The barn lanterns flickered wildly, though no wind passed through. Witnesses said the smell of blood and clay became indistinguishable. One woman screamed so sharply it cracked her teeth. The next moment, all three were silent. Then came a sound that no one could name. Not a cry, not a wail, but a deep vibrating note that shook the beams above them. When dawn came, the barn was empty. Only Jonathan remained, sitting in the dirt with his hands folded in his lap. He was smiling faintly. The floorboards were wet with blood, yet there were no bodies. No infants, no wives, just a shallow hole beneath him, and the faint impression of something having moved inside it. Something large, something breathing. When Amos arrived, he demanded to know what had been born. Jonathan looked up, eyes glassy, and whispered, "They went back." The sheriff who came to investigate found the earth beneath the barn warm to the touch, pulsing like skin. When they tried to dig, the soil bled. That same evening, Amos ordered the barn doors nailed shut. No one was to enter. But throughout the night, the hammering never ceased, as if something inside continued building long after the men had gone. By morning, new footprints appeared in the frost. 3 sets, barefoot, leading from the barn toward the Harlow house. When dawn broke over Mount Harrow, the mist was thick enough to erase the fields. The servants who dared step outside claimed they saw shapes in that fog, 3 of them, moving with slow, synchronized grace toward the manor. No sound of footsteps, no breathing, only the faint drag of cloth across the frost. By the time the mist lifted, the front door of the Harlow house stood open. Inside, the fires were dead, yet the rooms were warm, as if something had carried the heat back with it. Amos found Jonathan sitting at the dining table, his shirt soaked, eyes fixed on 3 empty chairs. When his father spoke his name, Jonathan simply turned and smiled. "They're home," he said softly. They found their way through. That evening, the house began to change again. The air thickened with a scent of milk and decay, and soft thudding sounds echoed from within the walls. Amos ordered the place searched. Nothing. Yet every doorframe bore a dark handprint, the same size, pressed high above human reach. In the nursery, a room long sealed since Jonathan's mother's death, they found 3 cradles that had not been there before, rocking on their own. The sheets were wet. At night, the sounds grew stronger, crawling, dragging, the rhythm of small limbs against wood. The servants fled for good. Only Amos, Jonathan, and the sound of those unseen infants remained. The father tried to burn the cradles, but the moment he struck the match, the flame guttered out, smothered by an invisible wind. Jonathan laughed until he vomited. "You can't burn a bloodline," he whispered. When dawn came again, Amos went to the barn. The boards he had nailed the week before were splintered from the inside. The soil below steamed, a heavy scent of sweetness rising from it. In the center of the circle, something had been left, a trail of afterbirth, small prints leading away in triplicate, converging into one. From that day forward, the town swore they saw a figure in the windows of the Harlow home, sometimes 3, sometimes 1, always cradling something that was never there when they entered. The first to see the eyes was Amos himself. He had not slept in days, pacing the hallways like a man awaiting trial, clutching his Bible so tightly the leather had begun to crack. The nursery door had been closed since the night the wives returned, or whatever had returned in their place. But as dawn filtered through the windows one morning, Amos heard a sound from inside, a faint cooing, the kind that could almost pass for an infant's if not for the low, deliberate rhythm beneath it, like the hum of a hive. He opened the door. The smell struck first, milk gone sour, blood drying on stone, the scent of earth turned inside out. The 3 cradles stood exactly where they had been found, their sheets damp, the wood swollen from moisture. One of them was rocking slowly as if being pushed by a breath. When Amos leaned closer, he saw what lay inside was not a child but a bundle of soil, wrapped tight in linen, pulsing faintly like a heart. Then from beneath the cloth, 2 small eyes opened, black, glistening, too deep to belong to anything human. They blinked once, twice, and then rolled upward, revealing the reflection of the barn ceiling above. Amos stumbled back, choking on the smell. The cradles began to move faster, each in rhythm with the others, rocking to the sound of soft humming. Women's voices, the same lullaby that had haunted his sleep for weeks. He tried to pray, but the words dissolved in his throat. The eyes followed him as he retreated, their gaze unbroken, their motion unending. That night the sound of crying spread through the house. Not from one cradle, from everywhere. From the walls, from the vents, from the ground beneath the floors. The crying rose and fell like waves, and in between each wail came the faintest whisper, "Father." By morning, every mirror in the house had shattered. On each shard the same image repeated, 3 faces pale and wet, peering over the edge of a cradle, smiling. By winter, Mount Harrow had begun to empty. Families packed what they could and left by wagon before sunrise, moving quietly, as though afraid to wake the ground. The air had grown sour with rot, and the snow that fell carried a faint pink hue, melting to reveal veins of red running through the drifts. The wells had turned bitter. The livestock were found bloated, their mouths filled with soil, and at night from miles away, travelers claimed they could hear the Harlow barn breathing, a slow, deep exhalation that fogged the valley like a dying thing dreaming. The Reverend's old church, long abandoned, became a refuge for the few who remained. They huddled inside with candles and quilts, refusing to speak the Harlow name. But even the church was not untouched. The wood along the altar began to warp again, bending inward as if drawn toward something beneath the floor. Some swore they could see movement under the boards, slow, crawling shapes tracing circles in the dust. When a boy tried to lift one plank, the air went cold and his fingernails turned black. The others sealed the floor with nails and salt, then left by morning. At the Harlow house, Amos watched the town's retreat from his window. He could not bring himself to leave. Guilt had fused him to the land like a nail rusted in its own hole. Jonathan no longer spoke. He merely sat in the nursery, humming to the unseen children. Sometimes the voices hummed back. Sometimes they laughed. One night Amos lit a lantern and went to the barn with a shovel. He meant to end it, to dig until he found whatever root he had awakened. The doors swung open before he touched them. The circle in the field had grown wider than before, its edge glowing faintly in the snow, breathing like a mouth ready to swallow. He stepped inside and began to dig. The ground was warm, too warm. Then the soil shifted beneath him as if exhaling, and Amos realized, too late, that the earth was not waiting to be opened. It had been listening. When they found Amos Harlow the next morning, he was kneeling in the center of the field, his lantern still burning beside him. His eyes were open, frozen in terror, and his hands were buried up to the wrists in the soil. Around him, the earth had caved slightly inward, as if something below had drawn breath and pulled him closer. No one dared touch him. The sheriff, summoned reluctantly, claimed that Amos's hands could not be pried free, as though the dirt itself had turned to stone around his arms. When they finally managed to dig him loose, his fingers were curled tightly around something soft and pale, It was a face. Not a skull. Not a corpse, but a face smooth as porcelain, featureless except for the faint impression of a mouth, and the beginnings of eyes pressed into the shape of it from within. The flesh, if it could be called that, was warm. It seemed to twitch when touched, like something alive struggling to remember what it used to be. The sheriff covered it with a cloth and ordered it burned. The fire would not take. Even drenched in oil, it only smoked, releasing a smell like wet earth and milk. By dusk, it had sunk back into the ground. That night, Jonathan buried his father's body behind the barn. No preacher came, no scripture read, only the whisper of snow and the faint murmur of his 3 unseen wives, their voices rising through the cold like a prayer spoken backward. When the last shovel of dirt was thrown, Jonathan looked to the horizon where the trees bent toward the Harlow house as though drawn by gravity. He whispered, "It's learning to see." By morning the face had returned, not in the field but in the walls of the house. It bulged through the wallpaper, smooth and pale, pressing outward as if trying to breathe. The servants who saw it fled screaming into the snow, but Jonathan didn't run. He placed his hand against it, closed his eyes, and smiled. "I know you," he whispered. "You're what he promised." The winter of 1844 arrived like a fever. The Harlow house no longer stood silent, it breathed. Every doorframe, every window pane, every seam of wood seemed to pulse with a low rhythmic expansion, as if the entire structure inhaled and exhaled through invisible lungs. The wallpaper rippled. The portraits swelled and sagged. Even the fire refused to burn steady, flickering in time with that dreadful rhythm. To those who stood outside at night, the mansion seemed alive, shuddering faintly beneath the moonlight, exhaling mist through its chimneys like a great slumbering beast. Jonathan wandered its halls barefoot, muttering to himself, his skin pale as chalk, his lips cracked from whispering through the dark. He had stopped eating entirely. Every morning he left bowls of milk and handfuls of dirt by the nursery door. Sometimes the bowls were empty by dawn. Sometimes they were gone entirely. Inside the nursery, the 3 cradles had multiplied. Where once there were 3, now there were 6, each identical, each rocking in unison, though no hands touched them. The sound they made was hypnotic, a soft, ceaseless rhythm that seemed to echo through the walls and into the floorboards. When Jonathan leaned close, he swore he could hear the cradles whispering, a soft language made of breathing and heartbeat. Then came the movement. The servants who hadn't yet fled said the walls began to shift. Doors opened onto rooms that had never existed. Stairways curved upward into ceilings. At night, the halls rearranged themselves, swallowing anyone who tried to leave. One stable boy vanished entirely. They found his hat days later, pressed halfway into the wall as if it had been absorbed. The house groaned constantly now, the sound deep and mournful, like a dying thing trying to remember how to speak. Snow fell outside, but the air within grew humid, thick and heavy. Mold bloomed across the furniture like a spreading bruise. And on the 7th night of the new year, Mount Harrow saw light, a pale pulsing glow that leaked from every window of the Harlow mansion, breathing in perfect rhythm with the sound of a newborn crying beneath the floorboards. When the snow began to melt, the earth behind the Harlow house turned black and soft, like flesh left too long in the sun. That was when the first of them appeared. The servants who had not yet fled claimed to see movement under the ground, the soil trembling, rippling outward, until small hands pushed through the surface. Not bone, not flesh, something between, wet, smooth, and the color of milk mixed with ash. The hands clawed weakly at the air before retreating, leaving behind faint indentations that filled with water and began to steam. Jonathan spent his days near the field, speaking softly to the dirt as though soothing an infant. Sometimes he would lean down and press his ear to the ground. Once he began to laugh, unquietly at first, then louder until it turned into sobbing. When the housekeeper approached, he looked up and said, "They're learning to stand." That evening the barn doors burst open. The air inside shimmered with heat despite the cold. In the center something had risen, a mound breathing, its surface undulating like a mass of lungs. As the townsfolk gathered from afar, they saw shapes beneath the film of soil, small twisting silhouettes, limbs entangled, faces pushing upward and sinking again, as though trapped in the act of birth. The humming began then, that same lullaby, now low and droning, spilling across the fields like fog. By dawn, the mound had split open. Within it were 6 small figures crouched and trembling. They were hairless, their eyes sealed, their bodies coated in a thin layer of dirt that never fell away. But they breathed, shallow, synchronized breaths that made the soil pulse around them. Jonathan called them his inheritance. He carried them inside one by one, whispering to each in a different tone, as if they understood. The next morning, the Harlow windows were covered from within. Every curtain drawn, every candle snuffed. From then on, the only signs of life were the sounds. Small rhythmic footfalls at night and soft laughter echoing through the halls that did not belong to any living child. By the time spring reached Mount Harrow, the town was no longer whole. People had begun to vanish, quietly, without struggle, without sound. At first, it was the ones who lived nearest the Harlow estate, a farmhand, a seamstress, 2 children sent to fetch water from the creek. Their homes remained untouched, meals still warm on the table, doors locked from the inside. The sheriff organized search parties, but the trails always led to the same place, the edge of the Harlow fields, and there they ended, as if the footprints simply dissolved into the soil. What they didn't know was that the missing hadn't gone far. Under the first thaw, dogs began digging up small shapes from the outer ring of the field. Not bones, not bodies, but things becoming bodies. Limbs forming from roots, ribs unfurling like vines. When one was pried from the dirt, it shriveled in the sunlight, collapsing into a smear of black ash. By dusk, the ground had swallowed the rest. The few townspeople who remained began to barricade their doors, but the night offered no protection. They heard knocking, slow, polite tapping that always came in threes. If answered, no one was there. But by morning, the soil around their homes bore footprints, small, childlike, each one facing inward toward the house. And then came the dreams. Everyone left in Mount Harrow began to share the same vision, standing in the Harlow field at dusk, watching the barn doors open, and hearing a man's voice whisper from the dark, "They need more to grow." Some woke with dirt in their mouths, some with their fingernails torn and black. Jonathan himself was seen less and less. The few who glimpsed him said he'd changed, his eyes hollow, his voice low, his shadow no longer matching his shape. He spoke of the town as if it were a crop, something meant to be harvested. "The roots are hungry," he said once, smiling faintly, "and they only eat what remembers." Autumn came early that year, abrupt and wrong. The crops turned white instead of gold, every stalk coated in a strange, chalky dust that shimmered under moonlight. The air smelled faintly sweet, like milk spoiling in the sun. No one in Mount Harrow dared to eat from the fields, though some said the Harlows had already begun their own harvest. From the hill, lantern light could be seen moving in slow circles at night, men and women digging, lifting, kneeling. But when dawn arrived, there were no holes, only smooth earth, untouched and perfect. The Reverend tried to intervene, delivering sermons about sin and deliverance. But even the church bells began to sound warped, as if their tone had thickened. He visited the estate one final time, desperate to confront Jonathan. When he didn't return, his horse was found outside town with its saddle torn clean off, its eyes missing and its mouth filled with soil. The pulpit stood empty the next Sunday. Soon after, the harvest began in earnest. The people who remained described it as a ritual, though no one had the courage to stop it. At twilight, the Harlow barn door swung wide, and a procession of figures emerged, walking slowly into the fields. They wore burlap sacks over their heads, each one bearing a crude painted face. The air vibrated with humming, that same lullaby that had haunted the town for months. It pulsed from the ground through the roots into the lungs of anyone near enough to breathe it. By midnight, the field glowed faintly, and the ground began to shift. The soil opened like lips, One by one the masked figures knelt, pressing their palms into the dirt as if offering themselves. The humming grew louder, deeper, until the field seemed to swallow its own sound, and when the light faded, only the masks remained, scattered like fallen fruit. Jonathan was seen watching from the porch, barefoot and smiling faintly, his hands coated in white powder. "They were never ours to begin with," he said to no one. "We just gave them back." Sheriff Amos Cutter was the last man in Mount Harrow who still believed law could tame the dead. He rode out alone the night after the hollow harvest, lantern swinging from his saddle, pistol drawn, though he knew bullets couldn't wound what moved beneath the Harlow soil. The townsfolk watched him vanish into the fog, and none dared follow. They said his horse made no sound as it crossed the frozen creek, that the lantern flame turned blue the moment he entered the field. What the sheriff found was not a crime scene, but a congregation. The Harlow barn stood open, and inside the air shimmered with a heavy warmth, thick with the smell of sap and decay. On the rafters hung the masks from the harvest, suspended by strands of root. They swayed gently as if breathing. Beneath them the dirt pulsed faintly, alive with movement. It wasn't until Cutter stepped closer that he realized the movement was hands, dozens of them, pressing up through the soil, small and slow, reaching for the surface like drowning children. He fired once into the ground. The echo swallowed the air. Then came the whisper. "They're only sleeping." The voice was Jonathan's, though it came from everywhere at once. He emerged from the shadows, face pale, lips cracked and trembling, holding one of the white-coated infants against his chest. The sheriff demanded to see the living, the townsfolk, the missing. But Jonathan only smiled and said, "You've already walked over them." When Cutter stepped back, the floor gave way. The earth beneath his boots sank, pulling him downward inch by inch. He tried to fire again, but the soil seized his arm, swallowing it whole. His scream carried through the valley that night, echoing for hours until it turned into a low moan that sounded eerily like wind. By dawn, the sheriff's horse returned alone, dragging behind it a coil of vine that ended in a human hand. The lantern was still lit. Inside its glass, something small and pale twitched, like an eyelid trying to open. The night the voices returned, Mount Harrow woke to the sound of breathing, not the kind that came from lungs, but from the ground itself. Every street, every doorway, every cellar floor seemed to exhale in long, trembling sighs. The air tasted like iron and milk. Windows fogged from the inside, though the fires had all died. Children cried out for mothers who no longer existed, and the few survivors huddled in prayer, waiting for a dawn that never came. At the edge of town, the Harlow mansion stood glowing faintly through the mist, its windows flickering like open eyes. From within came a sound, dozens of overlapping voices speaking in perfect unison, whispering names. Old names, forgotten names, the roll call of everyone who had disappeared. The voices weren't pleading. They were reciting as though the town itself was being counted backward into the soil. When the church bell tolled midnight on its own, something shifted. The wind stopped. The air thickened. And then came the knocking, gentle, polite, 3 times on every door. Those who opened found no one outside, only small indentations forming in the frost as if unseen feet stood waiting. Those who kept the doors shut weren't spared either. They heard whispers seeping through the keyholes, voices that sounded like their own loved ones calling from the field. In the distance, Jonathan's laughter rolled through the fog, slow, hoarse, and heavy with tears. Witnesses swore they saw him walking between the houses barefoot, carrying a lantern whose flame burned white. Behind him trailed the children, 6 of them now grown to the height of men, their eyes sealed shut, their hands raw from digging. They moved in perfect rhythm, humming that same lullaby, each step echoing like a heartbeat. By morning, the voices were gone. The town was silent. Smoke rose from the chimneys, but no one lived inside. Only the footprints remained, thousands of them, all leading toward the Harlow field, where the earth pulsed gently like a sleeping thing waiting to be called awake again. By the next sunrise, Mount Harrow was no longer a town but a grave breathing through frost. From a distance the place appeared tranquil, chimneys whispering faint smoke, shutters still, roads unbroken by prints. But those who dared approach felt the ground tremble softly beneath their boots, like the pulse of something vast just below the surface. The snow atop the fields rose and fell in shallow waves. It was said the earth itself had learned to mourn. Travelers passing through the valley in the years that followed spoke of strange sounds carried by the wind, the creak of beds, the lull of cradles, the wet suck of soil inhaling rain. Some swore they saw faces in the mud after storms, faint, childlike, their mouths open in silent song. The government surveyors who came to record the site never stayed past dusk. One left a single note in his ledger: ground unstable, breathing in intervals. Jonathan Harlow's name appeared once more in the county register, in a brief entry dated 1846. It read simply, presumed deceased. Estate condemned, but local stories disagreed. Some said he was seen wandering the forest, talking softly to the trees. Others claimed he had merged with the earth itself, that his voice could be heard through the plow, the well, the root. When a preacher from Augusta tried to sanctify the land, the cross he placed in the soil began to rot overnight. By morning its wood had blackened and sunk halfway into the ground as though swallowed. The preacher left before noon and never returned. The valley grew quiet in the years that followed, but silence is not the same as peace. Birds avoided the place. Rain fell differently there, slower, heavier, as if mourning something unseen. The few who traveled through said the earth seemed to listen to footsteps. Some heard a faint whisper beneath them, a single word drawn out like a breath, more, and every spring when the thaw came, the field bloomed, not with flowers but with small, pale shapes rising briefly before sinking back into the ground. In 1932, nearly 90 years after Mount Harrow was erased from county maps, a box surfaced in the archives of the Georgia Historical Society. It had no label, only a brittle tag tied in faded red twine that read, Harlow, unfiled. Inside were 8 photographs, a rusted lantern, and a single reel of magnetic tape sealed within wax paper. The photos showed the town as it once was. Dirt streets, a courthouse, the church steeple. But in the final image, something was wrong. The camera captured the Harlow mansion. Windows open, curtains drawn back, and in every pane the reflection of faces pressed against the glass. Dozens of them. Some belonged to the missing. Others had no eyes at all. The tape was marked simply, January 6, 1845. When restored, the sound began with a child's voice humming. Then faintly the voice of a man, calm, methodical, unmistakably Jonathan Harlow, reciting a list of names. The same names recorded in the Mount Harrow census, each followed by a pause. Then the sound of soil shifting, wetly, patiently. The list continued until it reached the sheriff's name, followed by silence. After several minutes the hum began again, this time deeper, slower, like an echo from beneath the floorboards. When archivists played the recording a second time, something new had appeared. Between the names, faintly, almost below hearing, another voice repeated a single phrase, "The soil remembers." The reel was sealed and reburied in the restricted archives, but the archivist who handled it died 3 weeks later, his lungs filled with a fine, pale dust that smelled faintly of milk. Today, the land where Mount Harrow once stood is fenced off, marked unsafe for excavation. No vegetation grows there. At night, the ground glows faintly as if remembering its own light. Local farmers still claim they hear breathing in the wind. Slow, rhythmic, familiar, and sometimes when the fog settles over the valley just before dawn, they swear they see lanterns moving through the fields again, each flame white as bone, tracing the shape of a town the earth refuses to forget.